In 2009, one of the most infamous games to ever be made was released. Assassin's Creed 2 made this franchise more than just a one-hit wonder and ended up cementing it into its existence within the gaming world today. It was the game that revolutionised the open world market, with many games to their detriment keeping many of the elements that worked for this game at the time still using them in today's day and age. It also brought us one of the best characters in this medium, with Ezio Auditore. This game put Assassin's Creed on the map, allowing us to follow a character with emotional depth and understanding that connected to many players to this day. So let's sit down and talk about Assassin's Creed 2 from its development all the way through to the impact it left on the gaming landscape and Assassin's Creed fans everywhere. So welcome to Assassin's Creed 2, An Exiled Video Essay. My first memories with this game was in 2010, when my friend brought around this game for me to try out on my new Xbox 360. For some reason, we ended up finding ourselves really immersed within this game, even though we were just sat on my coffee table enjoying it. He'd ended up bringing over the game a couple more times whilst I was trying to persuade my parents to let me get it, and during that time we did plenty of the feather collections and just went from mission to mission. From that moment to now, I've revisited this game almost every single year since release, and many times having played through it multiple times a year. I love every moment of each playthrough, and even to this day, I've never found this game to become boring. There are many reasons for this, but one that I have to get out of the way right away is the nostalgia factor, and that this game is connected to me because it was the game that I would play tons whilst growing up, and having sunk a ton of time into it, which ended up making me be able to de-stress as a kid. Clearly those stresses as a kid were a lot to deal with, so it made me fall into the world of Assassin's Creed wanting to learn more about the Templar and Assassins conflict, but most importantly, at that point of time, was the character of Ezio.
The Auditore are not dead! I'm still here! Me! Ezio! Ezio Auditore!
This game, along with Skyrim, was my comfort game growing up, due to the replayability of both games, but with this game, it had the perfect trio that every AC game needs, which is the time setting, location, mixed with a great character, with an arc that feels understandable, but lastly, it has charming gameplay that has many faults and infuriating issues, but it's a charm that is similar to how Skyrim's bugs are just a part of the game now. Now this video will end up being split up into talking about the game's development, the story, gameplay, and the impact that this game had on the world of gaming itself and the Assassin's Creed franchise. I want to answer as well the question within the thumbnail, which is this game brilliant, or is nostalgia blinding us? Just before we dive into this, if you do enjoy long-form content like this, then make sure to hit the subscribe button for more of it moving forward, as I intend to make a video about every single Assassin's Creed game in depth moving forward. But if you want to support the channel any further, you can always check out my Patreon, which will be linked down below, and if you're ever in need of a slimline wallet, make sure to go check out minimaldesigns.com, which will be down below as well. If you want to join our community over on Discord, again, everything down below. And lastly, I will be live just after this video's premiere has happened, and you can come hang out and we can discuss this video and other topics as well. So make sure to go check out the Exiled Live channel if you want to hear more of my thoughts about different topics outside of just video essays. But now let me take you back to 2008 when the development of this game had started. In the prep for this video, I chose to go and watch the dev diaries that were released by Ubisoft before the release of this game. And one thing was clear, they definitely cared a lot about this game, and they had a massive amount of ambition around it. Ubisoft Montreal, in comparison to nowadays, is just nowhere near the same level of care that they had for this franchise at this point. The development of this game was made under Ubisoft Montreal with a $24 million budget, and Patrice Deslette as the creative director who had a vision for his sequel. He wanted to see his brainchild become more than what it was within the first game, and saw Ezio as a more compelling, emotional story that would have a lot more weight behind every single ounce of it. And with that, they wanted as much emotional weight put by the devs towards creating this experience. One word that you'll hear a lot within these diaries is the word variety. Something that they definitely wanted to improve upon from the original. From the combat choices, the likes of allowing us to use the hidden blade as its own weapon, to the amount of extra bonuses to the quests and the point of intrigue. This game had many puzzle pieces that made it brilliant, however the main focus was definitely on Ezio. They wanted to make a character that was completely different to Altair, the man who was raised to be an assassin, so instead of a Middle Eastern medieval world fighting against the Crusaders, we were taken to a time of imagination, creativity and innovation. They chose the Renaissance as it allowed them to go into a time of history that hadn't been tapped in before within games in this way. But the ideas around what the Renaissance is was brought in, and Ezio was made into the human embodiment of this time in history. He was chosen to be a rich kid who had a carefree life looking to take on the role of his father as a banker, but got forced into taking on more responsibility than most. They wanted to make him the full embodiment of being Italian, from the charm to being proud about his family, his country, from being able to care about the people around him and show more respect, but in many moments have the anger and fire that comes out in many moments of this game. They chose to focus on a revenge story to give the player more understanding and to add more emotional weight behind the story being told. They didn't want to just focus on solely improving the gameplay from the first, they wanted to give us an improved story. This game is often considered a big innovator in the format of open worlds, and allowing the player more agency, which as you'll see within the development of this game was a massive focus. One change that allowed a massive jump in the player agency was adding the economy system to the game. This brought in change towards the ability to have multiple weapons, progression in many departments such as your armor upgrades, the auditory villa, and the ability to hire 3 factions that would end up giving you more options and choices to how you take on missions. One area that is considered a weak point of this game is the combat. This though was in fact a big change they focused towards within this game in the development. They wanted to add more variety in weapons and the ability to disarm opponents. This allowed them to add even more systems such as the enemy archetypes and the brutality of each attack. Within the first game, your sword felt like nothing more than paper swinging through the air, whereas in this game, every single hit feels even more impactful. And the further you get into the game, the change in abilities and the choices of weapons makes everything even more brutal every single time. With the archetypes, they ended up creating 3 new enemies, which are now considered normal, but with this they brought in the Brutes, the Seekers and Agile. All 3 are different in one way or another, however the most unique that was added was the fact that with the Agile they ended up having to create an entirely new AI system to ensure its variety. The Brutes are normal damage sponges. The Seekers are more aware and can notice you from further away, but the Agile is the one that can catch up to you, but more importantly, you can end up finding running away from you in many moments in this game. And their movement isn't something that you can necessarily predict, and that was incredibly intentional, which is the whole point of the AI that they created. Within the gameplay, they wanted to make a change to the mission structure and have more volatility, which was an interesting word that they used to describe this, but it's actually quite fitting once you get more and more into the game, because each sequence of this game definitely feels slightly more volatile each time. As you'll find that each sequence has a defining factor, but more importantly, each sequence is hard to predict. And in terms of the extra content, they decided to make more narrative missions, viewpoints, climbing puzzles, collectible quests, crowd missions, notoriety, and random encounters more of a thing. With the parkour becoming more of a defining factor of the franchise, which was definitely still irritating at the time and still is to this day, but at its time was incredibly innovative. They wanted to have the Assassin's Tombs as a way to show off their creative skill and the abilities to show off the parkour of this game and the architecture that they had built for this game and the Renaissance time period. This game was created by a dev team who wished to push the boundaries, and you can see this within the dev diaries, that they knew what they had on their hands would rock the world of games and open world games development forever. They truly cared about bringing a world and a game to life that truly felt unique. They focused on this idea of the Renaissance, and with that they encaptured a time in history with a game world itself, the innovation Ubisoft Montreal took between the first and second game, but also within the character of Ezio, making him the embodiment of what was the idea to be a Renaissance man, showing his journey over 30 years as he questions his life and what it was all meaning, as they knew it wasn't something that he could just learn over a couple of years, but it would take a lifetime. Ezio's story was heavily looked at as the story of the Renaissance by Ubisoft Montreal. There is one major difference between Ezio's and Altair's stories, and that is the creed.
We work in the dark to serve the light. We are assassins.
Nothing is true. Everything is permitted.
Within this game, Ezio is to become an assassin. However, during the whole thing, he is to become one, but without the title for almost the entire game. Ezio will be helped along his journey from a young, naive, rich kid whose biggest troubles was the rival family's son saying some rude things, to the need to protect his family in the best way possible at this current point for him, which was taking out the enemy instead of hiding from them. By the end of the journey, you'll see each member of the Italian Creed helping him prepare to eventually take on the mantle of Master Assassin. But this game starts in his first moments, the moments he came into the world. His dad will name him, and then we are taken to a 17-year-old self. Within this first moment, we'll see Ezio as a young man. He is espousing the sweet-talking persona we end up loving him for. He's able to talk to his friends and take them to go to war against the opposing sides. And then on the infamous bridge, the fight begins. We'll then be introduced to Ezio's older brother, Federico. You can see the bond between them even with the limited screen time. After this fight,
Just a scratch.
and seeing the doctor, we end up seeing it properly. This moment encapsulates the feeling of the Assassin's Creed title perfectly. And once you've climbed to the rooftop, you'll end up looking out over Florence with the best title card within this franchise.
It is a good life we lead, brother.
The best. May it never change.
And may it never change us.
Ezio's ways of being a young man get shown off within this first segment of this game. You'll spend your first hour getting to know Ezio, his family, and his friends, but by the end, you'll see the world be flipped right upside down. In this moment, we end up meeting Alberto,
Trusted friend of the Auditore family. According to the history books, this guy was a saint.
and Giovanni, Ezio's father. You'll help each individual family member, from his mother, Maria, who will then introduce us for the first time within the Ezio collection, Leonardo da Vinci. Someone who he wouldn't have thought would become a lifelong friend. After helping Claudia with her relationship issues, which gets a wonderful payoff by the end of Revelations.
Excuse me, Messer, but the lady and I are... Oh! Oh, il diavolo in persona! Stay back!
And then you help Federico with his feathers, which will introduce us to one of many painfully long collectible quests within this franchise. You'll be tasked by Giovanni to send some letters to his associates,
Don't worry, boy. We're not contagious. At least I'm not.
but by the time of arriving back at Plaza Auditore, you'll find that the place has been ransacked after a maid tries to knock you out.
Sir Ezio! I'm so sorry!
You end up speaking to Ezio's sister and seeing that his mother is completely petrified. Giovanni, Federico, and Federico have been taken prisoner. Ezio's father will tell him to use his talents of eagle vision to find the chest in the plaza, to take the letter to the man that we met earlier, Alberto. After Ezio dons his infamous robes for the first time, he'll end up taking the letter, and when he gets to the house, you'll see the man that you are meant to entrust, but you'll see a suspicious stranger in the background, donning a black robe, which I must say, in my eyes, is one of the coolest robes that we got within this game that I wish we got to see more of. Ezio hopes to stop the execution of his family, but by the time he gets to the square the next day, his life gets completely rocked. The one your father trusted turns out to be one of them, as he says, but one of who, in our opinion? The stranger we saw earlier is stood next to Alberto, and within a few moments, Ezio starts rushing through the crowd but was too late. With that, the end of the first sequence has been completed, and this has to be up there as one of the best opening hours to truly set the pace, idea, and plot on course properly. The game will follow the pacing of the first sequence almost the entire way through, but this is where the entire story starts and evolves. It becomes the idea of seeking vengeance, something that you can tell Ezio wants deeply. Within the space of an hour, we see him go from a relatively carefree young man to someone who has blatant fear in their voice. The first sequence is aimed towards setting up the narrative, whereas the second is definitely made to learn a lot more of the core mechanics of this game. From us learning about where Ezio's sister and mother are, which takes us to a brothel house to learn how to crowd blend, to seeing Leonardo again to fix the hidden blade. With these two skills now acquired, Ezio can now take on his first assassination target, Alberto. The first step towards revenge. In a way, in this moment, you kind of feel like he believes that this is the beginning of the end. But really, he didn't realise what can of worms he had just opened. After getting himself to safety and smuggling himself and what remained of his family out of Florence, Sequence 2 was wrapped up. One of the shorter ones within this game, but like I said, it's set up to teach us the basic mechanics, but also for the outburst of emotion that Ezio feels. Sequence 2 and 3 are meant to be looked at as more juxtapositions of what we see in the later entries, the raw emotion of the young, vengeful, fueled Ezio. Sequence 3 begins by introducing us to Mario.
It's me, Mario!
But truly what this is meant to show us throughout this entire sequence is the naivety of Ezio, and showing us the emotional depth of Ezio's character and the story of this game. We end up being introduced to Mario like I mentioned, and we learn to fight. After doing so, Ezio will claim that his duty is not to fight his family's fight, and this leads Ezio to go off without him.
You want to leave, Ezio? To throw away everything your father fought and died for?
Ezio, though, has that realization and heads off to Tuscany, where he'll join Mario for the siege of the city. Once we're on a rooftop to perch on, we'll see Ezio looking down upon the same man he saw earlier, but with his rival growing up.
Vieri di Pazzi, the youngest member of the second most notorious Florentine banking family. This kid knew how to burn right through his father's money.
His father and his great-uncle, Jacopo. Once the meeting is finalised, we end up taking down Vieri once and for all. This is truly the first kill of rage by Ezio. Alberto was one thing, but this was completely different.
Pezzo di merda! Vorrei solo che avessi sofferto di più! Hai avuto la fine che meritavi! Spero che brutto!
To the point where Mario has to step in to teach Ezio the proper way of respecting the dead, even if they were your enemy. To wrap up this sequence, we finish off by learning about the Codex pages.
Haha! You found another one! How exciting!
One of the biggest reasons we do a lot of the hunting down we do within this game, to create the map and understand the point of that exact thing. As I mentioned earlier, this sequence, along with the second, was made to be used as a juxtaposition on the Ezio we know later, to show us the actual character growth of his character. Many games will end up throwing us in a already or partly competent main character, but with this, he has complete lack of understanding, lack of maturity, and he has to build up this entire thing throughout the experience of his life. Sequence 4 is similar to the second, in that it uses the story and narrative to introduce new gameplay elements. Starting with the economy system that we were already able to access to a degree, it now though gets opened up fully to us that allows us to upgrade the villa and earn more money. We learn about Altair's armor and head to Leonardo to unlock the double hidden blade. And finally we meet La Volpe.
What do you want? Who are you? They call me many things. Murderer, tagliagole, thief. But you may call me La Volpe.
He'll make us do some climbing, but then introduce us to our first assassin's tomb, which we can use to unlock the armor of Altair later. Inside the tomb we'll listen to yet another Templar meeting, where we end up learning about their plans to try and replace the current ruler of Florence, the Medici family.
Your day is done, Lorenzo! Your entire family dies by my sword!
Francesco di Pazzi. Brought up as a noble in a city captivated by the newly rich Medici family, Francesco was taught to hate the middle class and its social climbers. Dismayed, he watched as the Medici bank eclipsed his own, and centuries of influence over the Florentine government slipped away.
However, we do interrupt the attempted assassination and escort him to safety. We're then tasked with assassinating Francesco de Pazzi. We climb to the roof of the same building that Ezio's father and brothers were held in and take down Francesco. After Ezio throws his body to hang down the side of the building for all the witnesses to see, the last member of the Pazzi family will gallop away in fear. Within Sequence 5, not much actually takes place. A lot of this sequence is us just learning about how to disarm opponents, and for me, doing 2 Assassin's Tombs. But really, we ended up not doing too much within this sequence, and it's definitely considered a lot more of a throwaway one. Within a lot of Assassin's Creed games, you'll see some moments like this that definitely would be classed as more filler content. But this ending at least gives us a great key moment for this game. We'll end up tailing the Templars and we'll find that Rodrigo had lured Ezio to witness Jacopo's death.
Fix this. Spare me. No.
Jacopo de Pazzi, the money. This guy was the head of the Pazzi family, and he ran their banking business.
To show us the difference in the ability of the Grand Master of the Templar Order to some wannabe assassin. However, we're now heading to Venice. With this sequence starting off with a carriage ride with Leonardo, who will tell us some lovely foreshadowing about learning how to make a man fly. After escaping the attack from the Borgias, we end up meeting Caterina, who again is one of many assassins that we meet along the way, but Ezio is unknowing of what they're doing. Nothing else though really happens, and we end up setting sail to Venice. After making our way to Leonardo's workshop, we witness the attack on the palace of some people who look like fishermen. After helping a woman back to safety who we learn is called Rosa,
Hey, I remember you.
we end up meeting Antonio, yet another assassin. We help by getting his men to safety and learn how to grab hold of ledges a little bit better.
So, how did I do?
After successfully attacking the palace yet again, we assassinate Emilio.
Emilio Barbarigo, titan of Venetian industry, terror of the underworld.
Nothing of massive value is gained within these moments. However, what we see is Ezio fully embracing his way of life, and it continues the pacing of this game, feeling the same as the first sequence all the way through, as we get slowly trickled down improvements of mechanics. Sequence 8 though brings us the flying machine, something that I only knew existed in year 6 in school because of this game. With the flying machine, we'll go on our way to stop the assassination of the Doge.
Ma cos'è? Shoot! Shoot the flying demon!
Which we end up failing to do,
You are too late. The Doge is dead.
but we end up assassinating Carlo Grimaldi.
Emerging from his palace in Monaco with a craving for political power, Carlo quickly became a key guest at the tables of Venetian nobility, while his reputation for discretion earned him entrance into the back rooms.
We again see Ezio showing some more respect on the ones that he kills now.
Requiescat in pace.
Within sequence 9 we unlock the pistol, which is a great tool to use, but this sequence is the one that the trailers are hinting towards most of the time. After competing in some party antics, we get a golden mask, which will grant us access to an exclusive party that our target is attending. And our target is
Marco Barbarigo. Although his brother Agostino was destined for greatness, Marco left his mark on Venetian history as well. A tyrant since he was barely old enough to walk, whatever Marco wanted, he got.
who became the Doge after the one that we had previously seen and got poisoned in the last sequence. All of it though was all a part of the plan to enact a tighter grip over Venice, but the party didn't allow it to last long. Next up, we end up meeting Bartolomeo and his sword Bianca.
Bianca! Bianca! Aha! Oh,
My darling. Thank God you're alright.
After helping Bartolomeo, we take down two men who are trying to stop us get access to their exclusive party earlier.
Silvio Bavario. Raised by wealthy merchants, Silvio was introduced to politics when his father was cut out of the family inheritance.
Who we end up learning again, this was all a part of the plan.
It's all part of the plan.
And Ezio learns this whole thing in Venice was nothing more than a distraction. At the beginning of sequence 11, we end up getting the first moment where Ezio is truly realizing what's been happening, and that he has been behind this entire time. In his conversation with Leonardo, he will talk about the prophecy, something that I haven't really mentioned up until now, mainly because it isn't a massive deal within the game up until this point. It gets roughly mentioned, but it's not necessarily something that Ezio fully believes in, as again, he's not an assassin yet. But what we learn about this is that from the codex pages, there is a prophecy to open a vault. With this, Ezio starts to realise that he's been too late to everything, and that Rodrigo Borgia is 2 steps ahead of him the entire time. After we impersonate a guard, we try to attempt to assassinate the Spaniard, aka Rodrigo.
A dark stain on human history, Rodrigo left a trail of blood a mile wide on his quest to unify Italy under the Templar banner.
Ezio doesn't believe in the prophecy, talking about how the prophet hasn't arrived, with Rodrigo thinking that the prophet fulfilling the prophecy has happened, because he believes himself to be the prophet, when in fact it's Ezio. After getting overwhelmed by guards though, all of Ezio's friends will come along who have helped him on his journey.
Don't worry, Nipote. You are not alone.
Orpe? What are you doing here?
We could very well ask you the same thing.
Rodrigo makes his escape, and we end up hearing a particular song.
Theodora? What? What are you all doing here?
Perhaps the same thing you are, Ezio. Hoping to see the prophet appear.
And this is yet again another amazing song from this game's soundtrack. All of the assassins arrive to see the prophet, to then learn that it was Ezio the whole time. We end up meeting Machiavelli, and we end up learning about how every single person who has been guiding him on his journey is in fact an assassin, training him to take on the mantle of an assassin. We then see Ezio be brought into the Creed. We then get brought to sequence 12 and 13, which weren't originally in this game, and were in fact added later on, which is really hard to believe. However, personally, I never remember sequence 12, and I always remembered sequence 13. I don't know why, in my mind, sequence 12 vanished from my memory. But to summarise, after we had claimed the apple at the end of sequence 11, Ezio ends up losing it again, and then we end up going on this entire hunt to go and find it. After the guy who stole it goes crazy with power, we take him down in some really long-winded part of this game, which completely breaks the pacing of this entire game. This sequence in particular is awful. But it does get a payoff at the end, which allows it to at least land with grace, even if its pacing was dreadful. With the last sequence, we end up heading to Rome to connect this game to Brotherhood, and we find Rodrigo has become the Pope. You'll use the apple against him, and he'll attack you with the papal staff, and eventually end in a fist fight in which we end up seeing Ezio's full maturity and or naivety again, where Ezio lets Rodrigo live.
Get it over with, then.
No. Killing you won't bring my family back. I'm done.
He doesn't take out his anger on him, but simply looks at him with empathy as some crazed, power-hungry man. Ezio will then open the vault, in which his conversation with Minerva will take an interesting turn, which then blends Ezio and Desmond's stories together. Ezio, in some fourth wall-breaking-esque moment, realises that someone is watching him. Again, we get a payoff for this later within the 2 games next. Ezio's story has highs and lows, but truly this story is about maturity, responsibility, and growth. We see him go from a brash young man and carefree boy to a jaded yet still charismatic man, who now knows of his role within the world, or at least the trajectory he has to follow. But this is where Desmond's story gets linked in, so let's spend some time and talk about the modern day. With Desmond, we get a brief introduction right at the beginning for anyone who didn't play the first game. What I noticed is that Ubisoft definitely were aware that this would be the case, that a lot of people would play this game and not have played the first, as this game in particular is set up in a way that doesn't require you to have much prior knowledge of any game previous, and it does a quick rundown for you. Lucy will help Desmond escape Abstergo.
Get in.
You're joking.
It's for your own protection.
Oh, man.
And then head off to the assassin hideout, in which you're introduced to Rebecca and Sean.
Who are you?
I'm sorry, where are my manners? I'm Sean Hastings. This is Rebecca Crane.
Nice to meet you, Desmond.
He'll then go into the Animus to learn everything he can from Ezio about being an assassin through the bleeding effect.
Deep breath.
Ah! Oh, what are you, a tiny child?
Sean!
But to also find out where the pieces of Eden are. However, the Animus does have some negative side effects, in which we end up seeing later on down the line with damaged cognitive function, which basically means Desmond is slowly going more and more insane and possibly could lose himself to the Animus, something that we learn more about within Revelations and 3. After waking up halfway through the game, Desmond will start to see hallucinations from the First Crusade, due to having spent too much time within the Animus. He'll head to sleep, which causes him to have some genetic hallucination in which he will be Altair meeting up with Maria, which ends up giving us an illusion, or at least telling us that Altair had a son. Desmond doesn't exactly do too much up until the end of the game, where we're pulled out of the Animus to deal with the Templars who are invading the place. Within the second game though, we don't end up getting too much in the way of Desmond's story. This doesn't really get fleshed out until Brotherhood, Revelations, and then 3. In a way, I would argue this game's focus was showing us the concept of following a character in a part of history can be really fun. They then expand on it even more within Brotherhood, which then gives us way more information about the modern day, which gets expanded upon in each entry, but we can definitely say the modern day within AC2 was nothing really that amazing. I love this game's story and the pacing is almost perfect. The game stays the same pacing throughout the whole thing up until Sequence 12, which is definitely the worst part of this entire game's story in my opinion. We get to see Ezio and Desmond in a way that doesn't ruin the experience of Ezio's story and keeps us engaged in learning about this world. The weakest points of this game's story in my opinion comes down to two areas. One is that the time to completion rate is like many games from back in this time, they're just very quick. Now this definitely does work, however it required another game and a half to truly give us that real sense of connection with this character. I would have loved maybe an extra 5 to 10 hours worth of content of this game to make some of the sequences a little bit longer and more story driven in some aspects, to maybe open this up to even more character development that we saw on screen. It would then make up for a little bit more story driven sequences to be added within the likes of Sequence 5, which were definitely quite short. However, I can definitely say that they pulled it off with the Ezio collection as a whole package. The other area of this game that is definitely the weakest point is its modern day. We come to love Desmond's story due to the depth that gets created within the likes of Brotherhood and Revelations, but this game was definitely a bit shy from wanting to tell its story due to it having such a great experience with Ezio's. In a way, it's like failing from your own success. Similar to how RDR2 for me made me get lost in the story so much to the point where I didn't explore the open world on my first playthrough. The story being told within this game is truly down to Ezio. We see him grow and become a man, being someone that has grown so much from throttling Vieri to the man who ends up showing mercy to the guy who ruined his entire life. This also pays off in many ways of bringing even more character growth within the likes of Brotherhood, where he'll learn that even his mercy can be weakness at points. Fundamentally though, this game is the hero's journey encapsulated very well. He no longer uses his father to deal with the guards after the events with Vieri on the bridge, or Christina's father. He now has to get himself and his family to as close as possible to freedom and fight for what he knows he needs to. But the story isn't everything this game has to offer. The gameplay, in fact, is a big part of this game's success, as it was able to incorporate just enough of the right things to create something amazing. Assassin's Creed is probably most well known for its parkour, and is the first series to truly take parkour as a serious element that the gameplay evolves around. Assassin's Creed 1 built on what they had previously already done within Prince of Persia: Sands of Time. However, as much as it was a better and more cleaner looking system, within the 2 years from the first and second AC game, they had made a good progressive leap forward towards making the parkour more fun and making it feel more fluid. Within this game, you had a good amount of extras given to the parkour, and changes to the standard, more basic free roaming that we got within the first game. And I think the first place to start as the most noticeable change is the speed in which you actually run around the map and parkour objects. This ended up making Ezio feel way more agile and, in a way, better than Altair at parkouring. However, obviously this is all down to the perception of it. With it, it allowed us to feel more fluid in our movement. However, one of the biggest changes that often gets overlooked is the addition in what you can actually climb and the animation changes for it. The reason this is the most important change is that it adds variation to the parkour that makes it feel somewhat different, even though it's still the same. This ended up getting innovated on every single game up until Syndicate and then Origins, where it truly got streamlined to the systems to be way more basic than even this game was. The additions to the parkour were the likes of hanging pots, which became synonymous with AC games, to the point where the new AC Mirage game is so hyped up on just for people seeing the factor that you could swing from hanging pots. You then had hanging poles to swing from, boards attached to the side of the buildings to come off of various different objects in various different forms. All of this just added variation to create the illusion of change and individuality within each area that you're scaling. This sadly wasn't changed that much within the later games and ended up being more or less a reskin of each other. We also gained springboards, ropes to cross, and higher ledges that we could grab a hold of. This again added more variety, which was important to the developers, as they wanted to make this game as open as possible to give you that feeling of choice. So adding the extra animations with the likes of grabbing higher ledges, running across the ropes, being able to springboard, and having extra parts of the buildings that you can climb, it made the game feel as if you actually had choice and weren't just climbing the same old buildings on repeat. However, within the parkour, one big glaring feature that was obvious to the average player who spent more than 10 minutes in the game were how sensitive the thumbsticks were, or maybe a lack of sensitivity depending on what you would believe when you're trying to climb up, down, left and right and backwards, and you find yourself just casually leaping across in a direction you didn't intend to because your thumbstick was slightly off to the left when you were meaning to go up, and did exactly what all good sequels should do, which is take previous characteristics and just improve on them. They made it a little smoother to parkour, but it was still not amazing. They added variety to give it an illusion of change, and then gave us a few extra ways to move around the map, which in turn made this game objectively better from a parkour perspective. But the biggest gameplay system that Ubisoft focused on within this game was the economy system. As mentioned within the development segment of this video, Ubisoft's biggest motivation towards the mechanics of this game was choice, as this game aimed to be an open world that gave you as much choice and freedom as possible. The economy system was one key part at bringing us this, starting with its customization. Customization was added to this game to make you feel more progression, with the likes of your armor upgrades. However, to make this progression feel like more of a choice was to give you that agency over Ezio's abilities and armor, to give you a better gameplay loop than just rewarding you after a mission. It actually makes you feel as if you're in control. It's a small change that many people might think, well, they didn't really need to do that, but it actually allowed us to feel as if we were progressing the character, when in fact, this would have just been the case that it would have been locked behind quest walls anyway. But this time, you at least had the option to buy the gear. But the reason this is actually a great system to have added within this game is it makes you want those upgrades, because you can see how much they cost, how far away you are from affording them, and how much it will improve your health. So it adds excitement to that thing that you want that other games would simply reward you after killing someone. This plays into the economy system, as allowing the player's customization and agency over the character's abilities from the armor to the weapons meant we needed ways to make money that actually felt like a progressive system. So with that, we ended up earning money after missions, side quests, robbing people, treasure maps, and random chests. And lastly, the biggest way to make more money that everyone loved was the Auditore Villa, giving us the ability to slowly invest the money that we made to make even more money down the road, allowed us to actually feel a sense of reward and progression and changes to the town that we were calling home. And with those upgrades you could buy better gear, cooler looking colour palettes, and more items from vendors. The economy system within this game on face value is nothing special, as all it is the ability to make money within a video game. What that money allows us is a sense of connection to the progression of our character and the world that we inhabit. It made complete sense that they heavily focused on ensuring the economy system was pushed to the player to interact with, as it allowed a better way to progress with equipment and give you that sense of progression that you might not have got in the first game. The only game that actually expands on the economy system after this in any sort of way towards player progression is Black Flag, with the ability to craft gear at a rate that's a little bit more interesting. Assassin's Creed's combat has never been something that's necessarily that special within every single game in the franchise, typically slowly becoming more and more streamlined. However, in more recent years, I will have to give it to the RPG games that they at least chose to put a little bit more effort into making sure the combat was a little bit better. However, the reason why it was never really that much of a big deal within these first games is that the Assassin's Creed games were meant to be focusing around the idea of being an assassin first, so they didn't really focus too much on combat. But combat was made easier within each game, but allowed more and more choice over time. The first big difference is going to be the hidden blades within this one though. In the first game you only had one, with that only being usable within specific scenarios. However, this game we eventually get two and are able to use it all throughout every single combat situation. Every time I play this game I can't help but stick to using the hidden blades. It just makes me feel as if I'm way more like an assassin, and being able to get up and close and personal with every single hit just feels way more brutal. On top of that, they added the poison blade, which added an extra layer of fun. It brings more variety to the game and how you can deal with different situations. Instead of just jumping down and air assassinating someone, you'll be able to sneak in, distract the guards with some women, and then take him down real quick with a poison assassination blade, which instead of, making him die instantly, that isn't fun. You might as well let him go crazy and watch from a distance. AC1 also gives you 5 ways to fight, with the hidden blade, sword, dagger, throwing knives, and fists, whereas this game gives you 5 new weapons. However, this is only really done to add the illusion of choice when in fact there's really no reason to use them. Within the combat, as I mentioned earlier, they added new enemy types on top of the regular guard with the Seeker, Brute, and Agile, which all of them come with their own different options, but most importantly, you can then disarm them in this game, which allows you to take on their animations and make everything way more cooler, such as using their spear to swing under their legs and take them down if you're fighting a Seeker. Now with the Seeker, their main attribute, outside of easily being dealt with, is also their ability to see you from a distance. Whereas other guards won't be as observant, in this one you're going to have to think a little bit more and consider taking them down a little bit earlier if you can. The Agile though can dodge your hits, which makes them a lot harder to fight in some scenarios. But the most well known trait of the Agile is them being able to chase us down and also tackle us. Something that can become a lot more annoying than that though is, like I mentioned earlier, the new AI model that they created for this game when they're running away from us to make them less easy to guess which direction they're going to be taking, so it meant that our movement wasn't exactly going to be easily guaranteed. The Brute though is obvious, is just a damage sponge, and also the fact that they're a little bit dumber than the other guards, and then you've got the regular guard, which doesn't have much change from the first game. One change though that I do think was really enjoyable to use in the later game was the addition of the pistol. It makes the way that you take down enemies just a little bit more interesting, and paired with something like the poison blade and smoke bomb, just makes you feel like the way you take on encampments and missions are just really cool and different each time. If you're able to actually put them all together, it makes you feel like an actual true assassin. Regarding those smoke bombs though, this game was the first one to bring the ability to the franchise, and honestly I'm so glad they did, as it made so much sense and it was amazing to be introduced into this game. It allows you to escape when you're in tricky situations, but it also allows you to get into those really close moments with a dagger or let's say your hidden blades and start assassinating people and dealing with them without them really being able to deal with you. The biggest weakness of this game's combat is its simplicity and the animation styled combat, but the best change was that it moved the needle towards having a more assassin experience, which for me just meant that even though the combat wasn't outstanding, it was actually improved from the first game by giving us more variety and options to play more like an assassin than the first game. But one of the big things that makes us as the player choose Assassin's Creed games to play is going to be the world experience and its open world. So let's spend some time and talk about the open world of Italy within this game. Assassin's Creed 2 truly built upon the first game. After this game, the franchise does slowly make incremental changes, however, a lot of what we ended up seeing within later AC titles, the open world formula can all be traced back to this game. In my open worlds video essay, I told you the two things that create an outstanding open world. One was the idea that the world feels alive, as if when you put the controller down, it still exists within your imagination. The other though was the drive to explore. Now AC2 isn't a game that I would consider an outstanding open world, however it is definitely enjoyable to traverse, which is something that we have to have noted. Even though this game doesn't give us a massive amount of reason to explore outside of running from quest to quest, or feels truly alive, it does seem to provoke something. The biggest issue for Assassin's Creed games has never really been their open worlds. The biggest issue, in my opinion, for many AC games in the modern day standard, and something like this, is that they've never really been an open world first game. And what I mean by this is that the roots of this franchise definitely prioritize the narrative and time setting, not the open world to be explored. Ubisoft have always been amazing at bringing us a time setting that we want to explore, however most don't make you want to explore because you want to actually see what's around every corner. The world that the game takes place in acts in more of a way as a backdrop to the narrative experience. We can walk around the world and feel as if we're in that time setting due to the feeling that the world gives off, from the ambience of walking around Florence and hearing the NPCs talking off in the distance, or the architecture of every single building. However, the world wasn't ever truly designed with this idea in mind to explore every single back alley. In this game though, they did add a few things to build incentives towards exploration, but they also added more interactable parts of the world, with the most prominent being Monteriggioni, which was a mixture of having a new system of progression and purpose to the area, which allowed you to change it for the better of the player and the location, which ended up being brought forth obviously by the economy system that we mentioned a moment ago. With this place though, it feels a lot more dark, and also a lot more murkier of a location than the rest of the game. In Florence, the game feels extremely white. It always feels like to me that there's just a massive overexposure issue. In Venice though, you'll still have that sense of white balancing issue, however because of the buildings having a lot more reds in there, it at least makes it feel a little bit more neutral. It's a small change, but it's definitely worth noting. In the whole game, in my opinion, there is a big white balance issue, however others do argue it has a purpose. Because in the first game there was the blue tint, so a lot of people come to the belief that a lot of this was done on purpose. However, I haven't seen anything that confirms whether or not this is true within the second game, as this game does seem to be a little bit brighter. The only reason that I could give as a metaphorical idea for why it would have been higher in white balance is because the first game obviously takes place in the Dark Ages, so having that blue tint to make everything feel a little bit more darker made some sense. And you know, coming out of the Dark Age, it was obviously to be brighter, so that's just one idea. So it's just another thing that connects this idea that the game is meant to be the video game embodiment of the Renaissance. Outside of this game giving us a place to customize with our main hub, but it also gave us a big change towards random events, which allowed you to feel as if you actually had a choice when you were dealing with, let's say, a thief stealing your purse. This is something that stems all the way back into the 70s with the likes of Dungeons & Dragons, so it's not necessarily something that's quite new, but at the time was new to the Assassin's Creed franchise. It allows the world to feel more alive in a way that wasn't truly experienced within the first game. In the first game, you could walk the streets and you could interact with them, but it never felt like the world was interacting back. This doesn't change too much in later entries to the franchise, but definitely started with this game. This game's open world is the format that the rest chose to follow. The viewpoints, the climbing puzzles that were made less and less interesting throughout later entries, collectibles, crowd missions, and dealing with notoriety. But even though I'm saying that this game's open world isn't outstanding, I also don't think it's awful. As I mentioned earlier, these games use the open world as a backdrop to the narrative, but most importantly with this game is that they wanted to focus on bringing the player more choice and more agency over Ezio. The weakest part of this game's open world is the same as every other in this era, which is that it kind of feels dead behind the eyes when you're playing these games later on. For some of us who love these games because of their stories, the worlds themselves do feel a little bit weird. If you look at every single game that came out within this time individually, they weren't necessarily much past a surface level experience. From the likes of GTA 4, that was definitely a triumph at the time, but looking back on it in the vast improvements towards today's video games, it is a hollow shell of possibilities. To the likes of Fallout 3 having the same issues where even though it's set in a post-apocalyptic world, it still feels dead behind the eyes and as if it's numb in some sort of way. These games were definitely precursors to the amazing games that would follow. The worlds were simply blueprints that slowly got improved on over time, eventually leading to the likes of Assassin's Creed Unity, Fallout 4, and GTA 5. All of these massive open worlds from this time all had the same issue of feeling dead behind the eyes, but it wasn't necessarily that they were entirely bad, but was simply what was possible at the time. So the weakness of these games, but more importantly because this video is about Assassin's Creed 2, is simply when they were made. It was definitely a triumph at the time, but now it's definitely hard to look back on these games with the current state of games that we have today and say that they were necessarily outstanding open worlds. But the best part of this game's open world is what Ubisoft have always done best, which is giving us a great representation of Renaissance Italy, and it made you feel as if you were actually within that time frame in history. Not just that you're exploring it as a playable character, but immersing you within everything about it, from the architecture, outfits, accents, interactions, and history. Assassin's Creed has never been known for its amazing side content, but it definitely does exist. As I mentioned earlier, a key part of side content within this game are its viewpoints, climbing puzzles, collectible quests, and side missions. So I did want to spend some time and talk about each one of them. Viewpoints are definitely the staple of Assassin's Creed games, being able to climb to an amazingly high building and see over the whole region, to then do the leap of faith into a haystack. Nothing could have been more succinctly an Assassin's Creed game. As much as people hate on them now, they definitely gave you an added purpose for exploration and increased the amount of map coverage you had. For a lot of us, we can now go without seeing every single inch of the map, especially for these older games when we're revisiting it. However, it's definitely useful when you're trying to figure out which exact area you want to go down when you're in a crowded location, as it's kind of annoying every now and again when you can't just see exactly where you're running with the map. Climbing puzzles is something that I wish we got more of within the later games, or at least the types that we got within this game in the future games. The main set of puzzles in this game are revolving around the Assassin's Tombs, which felt so much more grandiose and cooler to explore than anything else that we've seen in most of the other games. And it actually had an end goal reason which gave you an added reason to want to explore them. This is something that I'd love to see come back within the franchise. Within Origins, for example, is one of my favourites, where you get to explore the tombs within the pyramids. Collectible quests, on the other hand, are made for people who are definitely completionists, but in my opinion, this is the worst type of side content that they could add if it's going to be the biggest load of extras in your game. The collectibles available are the likes of the treasure chests, which aren't anything annoying as they at least give you a little bit of cash in the early game and aren't exactly something that you're gonna really care about. The feathers though are probably the most well-known ones in this game. You can collect 100 of these things, so if you're someone who loves to go to random spots on the map with zero reason outside of collecting things and being a completionist, then you'll probably find this amazing. When you've collected 50 of them, you'll end up being given this warhammer, and then once you've collected 100 of them, you get the Auditore cape. You've then got the glyphs, which aren't overwhelming when it comes to the amount of them within this game, but they're actually also pretty cool as they add levels of lore that you don't get within the first game, and they just expand upon things a little bit more for the player to understand with the world of Assassin's Creed. This is the sort of side content that I'm fine with when it comes around collectibles, as it adds more value to the world that they're exploring, and I'd love to see more of this in future games. You then have side missions, which definitely became more of a staple within the following games, like races, carrier assignments, beat-up events, and assassins contracts. They're definitely a great addition to the game to give you more than just a narrative experience. It adds more gamified elements, however I wouldn't say they're particularly engaging or interesting. Sadly, I would say the weakest part of these games, and most AC games across the board, is its side content, with the main fact being that they don't really add much to the world. Most modern day games will have full-fledged side quests that add more value to the world you're exploring, like the Dark Brotherhood quest in Skyrim, Wild at Heart in The Witcher 3, or even the therapy sessions within GTA 5. This game lacks anything with narrative depth in its side content, however it's definitely an addition to this game to give you more options to break away from the mainline story if you ever feel the need to. Assassin's Creed 2 was definitely Ubisoft's moment that left a mark on gaming forever. People who haven't played this franchise have definitely heard about how amazing this game is, from its story to what it did for the groundworks of this franchise. However, the impact this game had on the gaming industry is extraordinary. Many games take inspiration from this game's mechanics and story. With the likes of the beloved Horizon games with an extremely similar core open world mechanics, to the likes of Shadow of Mordor creating something that has the blend of the Arkham games with its combat to the parkour and assassination and stealth similarities of the AC games that got its roots in the first and second game. In terms of the franchise of Assassin's Creed, this game was by far the most monumental release for this franchise. It took a step forward and laid the groundworks for everything that we got to come in the later entries. Its story structure and pacing are the same as most that came after, but most importantly for Ubisoft, the success of this game led to multiple games being made year after year after this game. The Auditore family theme, or also well commonly known as Ezio's theme, became the signature Assassin's Creed track that got its own slight changes between entries to fit the game, but it was definitely something that was brought in because everyone connected with this specific song to be Assassin's Creed. Its impact left not only the people who played the game at the time astonished with its setting, architecture, ambience, stylistic choices, and narrative, but it also made companies realise what works for most of the players at that time. Sadly, the impact this game left on Ubisoft led to annual releases and the typical tropes that we always see from Assassin's Creed with collection quests, and the factor that the open world is definitely no longer optimal for the average modern audience. However, the question that needs to be answered is whether this game was brilliance or nostalgia. Is it that the likes of me and other fans within the franchise look back on it with too thick rose-tinted glasses? Or did Ubisoft actually make an amazing game with love that created something of a cult fanbase to this day? This game is definitely hard for many people to play who are new to the franchise, as it definitely didn't age well. However, one thing that I would mention is that pretty much every open world game from this era, like I said earlier, feels dead behind the eyes and a bit clunky. But one big thing that I think needs to be noted is that a lot of these games from then, a lot of people nowadays struggle to go back and play if they didn't grow up playing them. So I don't think using the argument that a game hasn't aged well is a good way of judging whether or not a game is good. In 10 years, we'll probably look back at the likes of Elden Ring, Tears of the Kingdom, and God of War Ragnarok as clunky to some degree. The only thing those games have going for them in the long run is the fact that their graphics are so good that realistically that isn't going to be the reason that holds back a lot of players, as we've definitely hit a plateau of graphical innovation at mass production. So for now, we can't see tons and tons of improvement, but what we can use to gauge these games is their gameplay elements and the emotional impact they left on the people who played them at the time. This game added across the board to the first game, from the classical elements of the parkour to the change in the details of architecture. We had more side content, however lacking. We had more of an emotional story, we had more lore that was added to the world. We got more of everything across the board, with some being a slight detriment, but in most cases it gave more to this franchise than it took away from the first game. I would definitely say that many of us definitely look back on this game with extra levels of nostalgia that clouds the likes of the parkour's clunkiness and the lack of good side content. However, I do think this game wasn't ever made as something to be amazing from the standpoint of those two things. We use modern day standards that we put towards games against the old ones, which in my opinion isn't a fair standpoint. When this game came out, it added a load of upgrades that added to the world of gaming and the franchise. I think this game was complete brilliance, as Ubisoft set out to create a sequel that did everything the first game did, but better. You can definitely see what they intended from the dev diaries, and you can definitely see that they had a lot of love for this game, which is why I don't think this is nostalgia. Some get clouded, but even if you look through the clouds, you'll see that something like this at the time of its release was amazing and brought tremendous value to the player. I love this game because it is my comfort game growing up, and I hope you found this as entertaining as I did to look into. Now, that all being said, hopefully you guys did enjoy this video. Hopefully I'm going to be doing more of these long-form video essays around video games in particular, as I haven't been able to for a while, but as I upgraded my PC recently, it's now allowing me to actually dive deeper into other games, and I plan to talk about each Assassin's Creed over the next year to 2 years, as I don't want to just release Assassin's Creed after Assassin's Creed. So this year you're going to see Valhalla most likely, and then also Mirage later on in the year. So if you are interested in video essay content from talking about games themselves to concepts around the gaming world, then make sure to subscribe to the channel, as I upload as often as I can, hopefully roughly twice a month if I can, but sometimes there'll be a bit of a delay as these videos are very big, take a lot longer than you would expect to record and make. So if you do want to support the channel any further than that, you can always check out the Patreon down below, and with that all being said, I'll see you guys next time. Have a good one.